Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to the City of London.
The City of London.
The next station is Bank. Please mind the gap between the train and the platform.
The financial heart of the country.
The City.
The City.
Welcome to In the City.
Stand clear of the doors, please.
Happy Budget Day, everyone.
Yeah,
Finally.
It's
I feel
here.
like we've been waiting for it forever.
Been waiting for it forever.
Been waiting for it.
It's here. We've all
delivered
watched the
it.
speech. It's just about an hour or so ago. So we're just going to try and get our quick reactions. But it was tabled as a big one, but it delivered, didn't it, Lacqua?
Yes, it did. 40 billion, which she said that starkly, which I think surprised all of us. And that will have made some of her own side happy in equal measure with making the other side and very, very concerned. And the thing that has probably jumped out for me about it was that more than half of that is going to be on this national insurance contribution increase for employers. And there's two sort of eyebrow raises about that for me. One is that it is for employers, and that's going to be tricky for people who run businesses. And then the second is, going to the heart of this question about, is this a manifesto breach or not? And I don't think there's a definitive answer, to be honest. I think it's just going to be a debate for a very long time.
I mean, there's a lot of tax hikes, there's a lot of borrowing, and there's a lot of spending.
Right, the
So if you
OBR
take
quote.
the money,
I like this. This is the quote from the report. One of the largest fiscal loosenings of any fiscal event in recent decades.
So this week we're trying to debrief on the fiscal plans set out and whether they'll make or break Britain.
Welcome to In the City, a podcast from Bloomberg about the stories important to the City of London. I'm David Merritt.
I'm Francine Lacqua.
And I'm Lacqua Stratton.
And with us is Bloomberg's UK economy reporter, Phil Aldrick. Thanks for joining the show, Phil. Covering many budgets over the years, and as you have, often, aren't they? But UK budgets can sometimes just be about rearranging the furniture, a bit of sleight of hand. This feels a bit different. Feels like something fundamental is shifting in the finances of the UK. There's big numbers being bandied around, big changes in the fiscal forecasts. What's your reading of the impact of this budget?
Yeah, it is a big budget. She said it was going to be a big budget, and I think she underpromised. Basically, the size of the state is going to rise to the highest sustained level in many decades. The tax burden is going to be permanently at the highest level, since the Second World War. She's borrowed significant sums. She's borrowed over the Parliament. She's borrowing £140 billion to pay for a massive capital giveaway. We've had a 40 billion annual tax rise. We've had something equivalent to that for spending on the NHS. What you've seen here is the big state sort of Labour ideology is firmly back. And
this is
high taxes,
this is old
big
Labour
spending.
ideology, right? We're not talking Gordon Brown.
No, it's not. It's definitely not Blair. It's more Corbynite than Blairite. It's more the recent era, more Milibandite as well, I suppose, than the cautious approach that New Labour took in 1997. So if they were walking that Ming vase across the floor, they've literally just thrown it in the air now. They said, we're going to try everything. And there are questions about whether there's a mandate for this as well, because none of this was in the manifesto.
But Phil, the basic idea, which we kind of knew, so she's gone overboard, is basically, higher day-to-day spending, and you have higher taxes to basically pay for that, and you borrow a lot more. Does that lead to better growth?
Well, the OBR's judgment is that it doesn't, because they've had to raise taxes so much. So, this budget was supposed to be both a budget to end austerity and to deliver growth. And the OBR is judging that there will still be real terms cuts, so more austerity for unprotected departments, despite all the extra borrowing, and that's on a day-to-day levels. And growth will be very slightly weaker, so the size of the economy will be very slightly smaller at the end of the 5 years. So she hasn't delivered on either of those metrics. Now, if you extend it beyond the 5 years, the OBR says you would get some growth because investment takes time to come through. But she's going to have to in theory, the good times are not going to show up until the second term. So they've got to get through the next election if these forecasts are right and not looking that good.
It's just, there's so many people scratching their heads this afternoon because a budget is the moment for a government to control the story. They had, she is writing the narrative today, and the narrative she seems to have written is kind of at least double negative in terms of you're not even seeing huge increases in public service spending. The NHS is getting more, but it's not kind of
so the NHS is getting all of it basically.
Yeah, and they made a big thing of she made a big thing of ending on education spending, but it's more than it was before. But it's not ginormous. So you've got this kind of head scratch of it was up to her to control the story, but the story is not clearly ginormous amounts more on public services. It's not clearly ginormous amounts more on growth. And then this fundamental problem, which none of us know the answer to, around it looks and smells and walks like a breach of the manifesto in terms of, no one, I don't know if you guys were able to see it. I was just watching the TV where Paul Johnson was very, of the IFS, was very uncomfortable because he obviously said before it was a straightforward breach of the manifesto. He didn't really want to repeat that, and I think we can all understand why. But, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury was also having to defend it and saying it's not a breach. And I think that row will go and go and go.
Because that's on the main tax raising move was national insurance for employers, wasn't it? What did she say? That's going to put in £25 billion.
More than half.
More than half. And so the OBR are looking at that as saying, actually, that is going to trickle through to people's paychecks. So their definition of working people.
Yeah, exactly the definition of working people that they've come up with. But I think, the OBR judges that 75% of the NIC's rise will basically pass through to employees in lower pay rises. So that is, the OBR's judgment is this is effectively through the back door a tax on working people. Which and then on top of that, there's other kind of taxes which are inflation and interest rates, and inflation is judged to be higher over the forecast because of these measures, and interest rates as a result also will be higher by a quarter of a point higher. So just interest rates will not come down as fast as we're expecting. What's going to happen to the bank with the Bank of England meets next week? It might. It's unlikely to change, but the immediate outlook. But you're going to have slower rate cuts is the implication.
What is all this borrowing for, Phil? Why is she having to raise so much more money, and where's it going?
It's the long-term plan. They have this ambition to be a two-parliament government, two-term government, it is absolutely without doubt that they do have a mandate to increase spending on public services and to fix core public services. And there is more money going in the short term to not to every single department, but to key departments. And the other part of it is there's been this absolute dearth of investment in the UK for a long time, and that would be through in roads, on hospitals, on schools, and all of this stuff. And so they are going to be spending, and on the green.
She said at the beginning, didn't she, the triple invest. Exactly. So that's the thing that it's the invest for growth, but they are going to have to go around on the radio rounds and media rounds and say, look, the growth comes after the 5 years, and the OBR has made this clear. But the growth comes, and it will come, but you will not see it in this forecast.
In half a decade.
But
yeah,
Phil, what happens to NHS? Again, so what's important is that she kind of changed the fiscal rules, right? She has her own metric on how she judges basically the day-to-day spending with when the books are balanced.
Yeah. So on the fiscal prudence point, I suppose linked to that is she hits her new rules, both of them within 3 years. The problem is if you compare it to the old rules that the Tories had, the debt rule there, she misses it. And she cited the IMF on this invest, because when she was out in Washington last week, they were saying you need to invest, you need the room to invest to grow. But the IMF also said your debt is on an unsustainable path. And the projections under the old rules for debt show it on an even more unsustainable path. So, then it comes back to the markets, really. There could be questions about whether the markets are happy to digest all of this extra issuance.
We saw the markets seesawing around a little bit while she was speaking. First of all, everyone taking it in their stride. Then we've seen yields go up a little bit as people seem to digest. Don't know where they're going to be by the time this podcast comes out, but there is nervousness out there, isn't there, about piling on so much more extra borrowing to the UK? Can the market take it? The shadow of the Truss mini budget fiasco looms over this whole process. People remember what happens when the gilt market takes fright, so they seem to be careful about that. And yet there's still jitters out there, aren't there?
Yeah, there was in the sort of build up over the last week or so, there's been sort of a negative reaction in markets. I suppose they're anticipating the worst, and then yesterday and this morning there was a bit of a recovery, and everyone was thinking it's not going to be such a big event, and then it has dropped away again. Partly because the OBR actually specifically says interest rates and gilt yields will be a quarter of a percentage point higher. So the markets still are trying to clearly they've been trying to digest this, and they have. As we're talking, they still haven't quite worked out where to settle. But it's not. It doesn't look like it's going to be a quasi budget. The amount of borrowing they did in that budget was far more.
The thing that we forget about that one was that the kind of original sin of that was that she kind of kicked out the referee. And so that sense of the OBR not being in the room, and that's kind of the contrary is true now.
Yeah, and it was the bean counters, right? It was all her rhetoric in the lead up before she became prime minister.
Yeah. So I think it's tempting, but it's probably not right to sort of try and constantly look for parallels to that extraordinary budget. It's really going to go down in history. This budget today, Wednesday, will go down in history for a different reason. Just the numbers are so massive. I think the thing that I reflect on, if you think back to the general election and the nature of how it was fought, and it was fought on, no one was talking about tax rises and the IFS, which I think we do have to keep referring to because they are one of the only referees we have in this. They said there's a conspiracy of silence around this area, and then fast forward, 4 months, 5 months, and we've got not just tax rises, but some of the largest any of us can recall.
And listening to Rishi Sunak's response to Rachel Reeves, I guess it was his final big performance in the Commons, so he seemed to really relish it in that respect. I mean, he was being very punchy about this, saying exactly this, that he warned all the way through the election campaign.
She did.
Labour are going to put up your taxes and spend more money, and no one listened. I mean, it's actually...
And he got in trouble. I mean, do you remember the first TV debate, and he said the 2000, and Keir Starmer didn't react very swiftly, and he got in trouble, but from all sorts of panjandrums, authority figures. And I don't know whether, it's too strong to say looking back he was right. He was positing a case rather than had evidence. But you're right, it was his last turn in the Commons, and quite a moment for him, right, to say, hold on a second, you didn't listen to me.
Phil, was it all bad for, workers? I guess the minimum wage went up a little bit, maybe not by as much as was recommended, but it went up. State pensioners, also there's a triple lock. I mean, it's not, I guess, all bad.
People on lower incomes are going to get paid more. The fiscal drag, the rabbit in the hat was letting speculation rife about freezing thresholds for 2 more years, and she didn't freeze thresholds at all any longer than they're currently planned.
So that's still a couple of years away.
And the other one, so we still got to get through. I think it's 3 more years before that.
And she did protect micro businesses from some of the changes on the NICs.
Yes, the small bit. So the employment allowance so they don't pay. So small businesses will be protected from a large degree of it, and fuel duty as well. Like that, she maintained the freeze, which was around a £5 billion cost. So the motorist lobby will not be haranguing her.
And one of my favourite posts in our live blog for it was around what's known as the sin taxes and sin companies. So it's booze, ciggies, and gambling. Those stocks all soaring because either duty on, say, pints of beer was cut in the pub, or there weren't new measures brought in on things like gambling. But all of those things are sort of on the margins, aren't they? It's kind of, they grab a headline in the Sun newspaper maybe, but you're going to move the dial.
Yeah, there's some nice to haves.
Right. But what about the stuff that we've been talking about for a while on this podcast around the city? Yeah, the stuff that the financial markets care, all the financial people working in financial services care about. The non-dom rule, carried interest for private equity, capital gains tax. I mean, there was a lot of talk about that beforehand. It felt to me like she was delivering a little bit less of a hit on those places than perhaps had been feared.
Yeah, so it was about 6 billion from capital gains tax and inheritance tax out of the 40 billion. That doesn't feel like a sum that people and entrepreneurs are going to throw their toys out the pram for. The plans on non-doms and carried interest, she was actually saying there's still consultation to be done around this area a bit, but
so more to come.
More to come. So, or actually less to come. You could argue so. But and that raised roughly what was expected. There wasn't a tax on the banks, for example, which there were still rumblings that might happen. And really, she turned the national insurance tax rise on businesses at just a broad base. So she did one big tax rise in the end. That's done
tax,
it,
wasn't it? That?
Yeah, that's what she called it. But I mean, isn't that a funny? We should be self-aware, and in this podcast we have had guests on, and ourselves we've done it, talking about poor non-doms and they need to be protected and all of that. So in that sense she listened, but equally it is an odd political choice that she has chosen to put the pain on business. And that can be small business above micro businesses, but like those kind of businesses with like 20 people, that's quite a choice.
Because she also cut the level, didn't she? Like from 9,000 or something to 5,000. So much lower paid people, or you're hiring much lower paid people.
It is hairdressers
and you're going to have to pay.
I mean, not the hairdresser with one or two stylists, but the sort of medium size. Businesses in the Midlands and so on. It's not money bags that are getting this burden. It's normal businesses.
Yeah, I guess what that came down to is that she probably didn't want an omni-shambles budget, and the fact that she'd ruled out 70% of the tax take from any further tax rises. Obviously, then they reversed out of that by doing the nix on employers, but nix rise on employers. But they must have decided that doing a massive spectrum would just run into some trouble, like Osborne got in 2012 or whenever it was. So this was basically putting it all on employers, and she said, "I'm sorry, I don't want to do this."
And I thought one of the Phil. I mean, for me, the question is, who's this budget for? Like, if you look at the budget, you read it, you listen to her. Like, what kind of economy does she want? I mean, this is so left-leaning, maybe more left-leaning than
yeah. I mean, but you could argue it's low-income workers and for public sector workers, basically. I mean, you are basically putting a lot of investment into the public sectors, and by association, I think that the general public actually does want a working NHS. It doesn't want local governments falling over. It wants a social care. So people want this money spent. It is coherent in that degree. It's just quite a lot more than people were expecting.
And I thought it was a really powerful passage in the budget where she said, she sort of took the criticism head on and said, healthy businesses need healthy schools and healthy workforces, and they need, it's not either or to be taking money from businesses to give to schools and hospitals. Businesses will benefit, and that is clearly right. And it reminded me of some of the Obama language. So I thought that was powerful. I think where I am worried is it's very reductive to say we're increasing the minimum wage and we're doing these very targeted things for low income workers if the companies they are working for are feeling under extreme pressure, not just for one reason, but these other reasons like changes in regulation and labour law. Obviously now the national minimum wage, and then obviously things like capital gains tax, and we can keep go on. There's so many, and I think that's the thing I worry that they don't fully understand. You can't really think, when you think about the Labour front bench, which of them have run businesses. Yeah. They talk about wealth creation. I don't think they quite understand it.
But they had to tax someone. Yes. If you need to, if you want to spend and have a working NHS, you have to find money somewhere. So is it? Can she correct this if it doesn't go to plan in 7-8 months?
I don't. In an ideal world, the OBR's made an error in just judging that the growth will come through much more slowly than it actually will come through. It is generally accepted that investment will drive growth, and so she'll be hoping. Yeah. She'll be hoping.
We all have to
hope
that
actually things will be better than
it is true, isn't it, that she's going to have many budgets to.
She's got 4 more.
She's got 4 more. At least.
Well, she said she won't do 2 a year.
Right. Okay. No emergency budget.
We've even got the spending review next March, and although that envelope has been set now, so the total amount of spending for these departments has been set now. It's conceivable that if they get a new forecast which actually is a little bit more optimistic, or there's something else has happened here, then she might have a little bit more money. Well, also the other thing we didn't mention was the post office, the Horizon scandal, compensation payments, and the infected blood.
Right.
So that was a chunky. That was like, what was it, 14 billion cost just to, and those were sort of they had no money.
Legacy
Nobody
items.
had set money aside for that stuff. So that sort of stuff had to. And she did obviously reiterate the point that there was some manner of fiscal hole. It's not clear that the full 22 billion. The OBR didn't sign off the full 22 billion, but they definitely indicated that there were some unspecified underspends which had to be met. So there were some things she had to deal with.
What will Andrew Bailey have been thinking during the? I mean,
Sweaty palms.
I don't know. Does he shout at the TV?
She took care to love on him, didn't she?
Oh yes, yeah.
What's he thinking now?
Well, it's an expansionary budget. Even the OBR says inflation is going to be higher as a result, and they say, and they say interest rates would be higher than otherwise. Interest rates, the bank's already been saying that we're way into restrictive territory here. So they're expected to cut rates in November. I would fully expect them to go ahead with that. There was a suggestion that they might go to sequential rate cuts because inflation is below target at the moment. But they might just choose to not go to sequential rate cuts and do it at every other meeting, so 4 times a year, which is what the current expectations by market participants are.
But still a forecast for rates to come down, even if we're seeing gilt yields increasing.
Yeah,
of this budget.
The curve is priced much lower than where rates actually are now. So you would expect rates to come down.
Do you think they're counting on the rest of the world being a little bit wobbly to borrow more? That they're expecting actually, the bond markets to be behind them for the next 12 months.
Yeah, I think they are. I think they're counting on that. And so, I imagine the bond markets will be. I mean, we're not a basket case. So, well, we were 2 years ago briefly.
Famous last words.
Overall, Phil, what's your biggest takeaway from this huge fiscal event we've all been unpicking today? Is it the increase in borrowing? Is it the spending? What's your headline?
I guess it's just the big political shift. It isn't New Labour who they wanted to tread slowly. This is an impatient government that wants to handbrake turn the economy and the state into a different way of operating, and they want to get on with it, and they're willing to take a risk to do. This is a gamble. If it doesn't deliver, then they'll be kicked out in 5 years' time because high taxes, a state that hasn't got rid of austerity, and sluggish growth is just not going to do it. So this is a big, principled Labour budget.
Thanks for listening to this week's In the City from Bloomberg. This episode was hosted by me, David Merritt, with Francine Lacqua and Allegra Stratton. It was produced by Summer Sadi, production support from Isabella Ward, and sound design by Moses Andon. Brendan Francis Newnham is our executive producer. Sage Bauman is head of podcasts. And special thanks to Philip Aldrick. Please subscribe, rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts.